Beatrice Ashford broke her sister's seal for the third time in the carriage, smoothed the single folded sheet flat against her knee, and read the word she herself had been ordered to deliver. No. It was written in her own hand. That was the cruelty of it. Cordelia had refused to put pen to the page at all. You write a prettier no than I ever could be, and your fingers are already stained. And so the refusal of the most eligible man in 3 counties had been composed, sanded, and sealed by the very woman now sent to carry it 60 miles to his door. The carriage wheels turned through summer dust. Beatrice watched the great gates of Ravensmere swing open ahead of them, 2 wings of black iron crowned with a stone raven, and felt the bottom drop out of the morning. She knew this house. She had never once set foot in it, and she knew it the way one knows a face from a portrait painted by a loving hand, because for 11 months she had been writing letters to the man who lived inside it, and he had written back, and every letter he sent had described some new corner of the place, as though he were furnishing a home for 2. The long library with the south windows, the walled garden where the espaliered pears were trained against warm brick, the morning room where the light came in gold before 9, and where, he had written, he liked to imagine a particular person sitting one day with a book she would not put down for him. That person had a name on the envelopes. The name was Cordelia. The carriage stopped. A footman in dove-grey livery opened the door and let down the step, and Beatrice gathered the letter, her gloves, and the last of her composure, and stepped down into the heat. The air smelled of cut hay and box hedge, and the particular dry sweetness of a June that had not seen rain in a fortnight. Somewhere beyond the house a scythe was working. She could hear the long hiss of it, and a blackbird, and her own pulse. "Miss Ashford," said the footman, in the careful voice of a servant who has been told to expect a different lady, and is too well trained to show it. "His Grace is in the library, if you will follow me." She followed him through a hall floored in black and white marble, past a staircase that climbed into cool shadow, and she thought, I have walked here 100 times in my own head. She had described this hall to Cordelia, who had not listened. She had answered his questions about books her sister had never read. She had argued with him, on paper, about whether mercy was a form of justice or its opposite, and she had won, twice, and he had conceded both times with a grace that had undone something in her she had not known was fastened. Now she had come to tell him none of it had been real. The footman opened a door, said her name into the room, and withdrew. The library was exactly as he had written it. South windows, warm light lying in long bars across a turkey carpet worn pale in a path between the desk and the hearth. The path, she understood at once, of a man who walked when he thought. And at the far end of it, rising from behind the desk, was the Duke of Ravensmere. Beatrice had built him 100 times out of ink, and had got him entirely wrong. She had imagined a man older, drier, a little stooped from his books, the sort of man who would write the sentences he wrote. The man who stood was 8 and 20 at most, broad through the shoulder in a way no coat could disguise, dark-haired, with a jaw set hard, and a pair of grey eyes that moved over her once, swiftly, and then steadied on her face with the particular stillness of a man bracing for a blow. He filled the end of the room the way weather fills a sky. There was nothing dry about him at all. "Miss Ashford." His voice was low and even. "You are not the Miss Ashford I was expecting." "No, Your Grace." Her own voice came out steadier than she had any right to. "I am her sister, Beatrice." Something crossed his face. Recalculation, swift and controlled. "Beatrice," he repeated, as though testing whether he had heard the name before. He had. He had written it once, asking after "your sister Beatrice," who I am told reads even more than you do. And Cordelia had laughed and told Beatrice to invent something modest. And Beatrice had answered the question herself, in the third person, lying about how little she read. "Your sister is well, I hope?" "She is very well." Beatrice's hand closed on the letter. "Your Grace, I was asked to bring you this, in person. My family felt, that a matter of such importance should not be left to the post. She held it out across the breadth of the desk. He did not take it at once. He looked at the folded sheet, at the broken seal she had broken herself, and then at her. And for a moment the whole bright room seemed to hold its breath. He had been waiting 11 months for an answer. He had asked for Cordelia Ashford's hand by letter in April, and he had been answered with silence, and then with the promise of a reply delivered by family. And a man who has staked everything on a sheet of paper learns to read the weather of a face before he reads the words. "You have already read it," he said quietly. "Yes." "Then perhaps you would do me the courtesy of telling me, rather than making me discover it standing in my own library." It was not unkind. That was the worst of it. He had given her the choice that a gentler man would have given. Beatrice lowered the letter and met his eyes and made herself say it plainly, the way she would have written it if she had been writing it to him alone, which, in a sense, she had. "My sister cannot accept your offer of marriage, Your Grace. She is... her affections are otherwise engaged. She is deeply sensible of the honor you have done her, and she wishes you every happiness. And she is sorry." There was a silence in which the scythe hissed once, twice, far off across the lawn. The Duke of Ravensmere set both hands flat upon his desk and looked down at them. He did not pale. He did not flinch. He was too disciplined for either. But Beatrice, who had spent 11 months learning the inside of his mind one letter at a time, saw the thing go through him like cold water through stone. And she had to fix her gaze on the raven carved into the chimney-piece to keep from saying the unforgivable thing, which was, "I am sorry. I am sorry it was never her. It was always me." "Otherwise engaged," he said at last. "I see." He straightened. Whatever had moved in him was put away. "Will you sit, Miss Ashford? You have come a long way to deliver 4 lines. And the least Ravensmere can offer is a chair and something cold. You look as though the road has been hard on you." "You needn't, I should like to." He said it with a control that was its own kind of plea. "If you go straight back into that carriage, I shall have nothing to do for the rest of the day but think, and I find I would rather not. Sit. Tell me about the road. Tell me anything. I'm told you are a great reader. Tell me what you are reading. I should be grateful for a quarter of an hour in which I am not a man who has just been refused." And Beatrice Ashford, who had come to break the only thing she had ever built, sat down across from the man she had built it with, and felt the trap of the next several days close softly around them both. She had not meant to stay even a quarter of an hour. She stayed 2 in the end, that first day, because a thunderhead had been building all afternoon out of the white June haze, the kind of dry summer storm that comes up violet over the hills and breaks all at once. And by 4 o'clock the rain came down in ropes, and the road to the coaching inn was a river of red mud, and the Duke's housekeeper, a starched and immovable woman named Mrs. Freen, declared in a tone that brooked no argument that no lady was leaving Ravensmere in such weather, and the matter was settled over Beatrice's head before she had finished her lemonade. So she was given a room, and a maid, and a place at a dinner table built for 40, at which she and the Duke of Ravensmere sat at one end like 2 survivors of a shipwreck, with the rain hammering the long windows and the candle flames leaning in the draught. It was at that dinner that the trouble truly began, because the Duke, having put grief away where he kept everything else, set himself to be a host, and asked her about a book. "You mentioned before the storm that you were reading Cooper," he said. "I confess I have never been able to forgive him the rabbits." Beatrice's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, because she had not mentioned Cooper. She had written about Cooper 8 months ago in a letter signed Cordelia, in which she had defended the task against exactly this charge, the rabbits, the tame hares that the poet kept and grieved, which her correspondent had called sentimental, and she had called the truest thing in the poem. "The hares," she heard herself say, before she could stop herself. "Not rabbits, and I would defend them to my last breath." The Duke went very still. The candle flame leaned across the white acreage of the tablecloth. His grey eyes came up and fixed on her with a sudden, total attention that she felt down to the soles of her feet. "Would you?" he said softly. "How strange. Someone once defended them to me in almost exactly those words." He set down his glass. "She had your turn of phrase, Miss Ashford. Your sister." "We were raised on the same shelf of books," Beatrice said, and reached for her wine to hide her face and thought, "Be more careful. Be so much more careful, or you will undo her and yourself and him all in one breath." "It would be stranger if we did not sound alike." "Yes," he said slowly. "I suppose it would." But he went on watching her down the length of the table, and the rain went on falling, and somewhere above them in the great sleeping house, the letters she had written him lay in a locked drawer where he had kept every one, and the past she had thought she was burying sat down with them at the table and refused, very quietly, to leave. The storm did not break itself out overnight. It settled in, as the dry summer storms sometimes do, and turned the roads to a red ruin that not even the Duke's own coachman would attempt before the ground had drained, which Mrs. Freen pronounced would not be before the third day at the earliest. Beatrice wrote to her family by the morning's first rider, a short, careful note that said the refusal had been delivered, that the Duke had behaved with perfect honor, and that the weather detained her. She did not say what else detained her. She did not have a word for it that she was willing to put on paper, and she, of all people, knew the danger of paper. She came down on the second morning, meaning to keep to her room, to be a ghost in the house until the road let her go, and found the Duke of Ravensmere in the breakfast room, with 2 cups already poured, reading a newspaper 4 days old, and entirely unsurprised to see her. "Mrs. Freen tells me you were up before the maids," he said, without lowering the paper. "She disapproves. She believes a lady who rises early is plotting something." "And what does Mrs. Freen believe a gentleman who rises early is doing?" "Suffering nobly." He folded the paper. The grey eyes considered her over it, with a glint that had not been there yesterday. Yesterday there had been only the wound. "Sit, Miss Ashford. I have decided that since the heavens have made you my prisoner, I shall be a tyrant about it, and require your conversation at every meal. You may consider it the ransom." "That seems a great deal to ask for 3 days' shelter." "It is shelter and a horse you cannot ride out on, lemonade, the use of my library, and the protection of Mrs. Freen, who would defend your virtue against a regiment. I think my conversation is cheap at the price." He pushed the second cup an inch towards the chair opposite. "Besides, I find you interesting, and I am a man with very little to be interested in this week, and you would not be so cruel as to deny a refused man the one diversion the storm has washed up at his door." She should have refused. She knew she should have refused. Instead she sat, because she was weak. Because 11 months of writing to him had built a hunger she had told herself was a hunger for words, and now understood, with a lurch, was a hunger for him. And she took the cup, and she said, "Very well, Your Grace. But I warn you, I am not nearly so agreeable in person as I am, as my sister is, on paper. I argue. I have opinions about the militia and the corn laws, and the proper way to prune a pear, and I will not be talked out of any of them to spare your feelings." Something flickered across his face at "on paper," gone before she could be sure of it. "As your sister is on paper," he repeated. "Tell me, and you must forgive an indelicate question from a man with nothing left to lose. Did you have a hand in those letters, Miss Ashford?" The breakfast room was very quiet. A bee had got in through the open window and was knocking itself softly against the glass higher up, trying to leave the way it had not come in. Beatrice felt the whole morning narrow to the point of his question, and understood that he had walked her into it deliberately, the way he walked when he thought, and that he had been thinking since the hares. She had a choice. She could lie, cleanly, completely, the way she had lied for 11 months, and the road would dry, and she would go home, and he would marry some duke's daughter, and she would be the woman who once wrote to him without his ever knowing her name. Or she could tell a half-truth and hope it held. "My sister and I are very close," she said. "When a letter mattered, she would read it aloud to me and we would settle on what to say together. The way sisters do." "The way sisters do," he said. "And which of you settled on the hares?" "Does it matter, Your Grace?" "It matters to me more than I can tell you," he said, and the lightness was gone from his voice. And for one terrible moment, she thought he had guessed everything. "Because there were perhaps 4 letters in 11 months that I have read until the folds wore through. And I should like to know whose mind I was reading. A man can fall a long way into a person's mind, Miss Ashford, before he ever sees her face. I had built a whole life out of those letters. I find I am not ready to be told that the woman I built it with does not exist, that she was a committee of 2 sisters at a breakfast table, deciding what would please me." He stopped himself. "Forgive me, that was unjust. You are not on trial. Drink your chocolate, it is going cold, and Mrs. Freen grades me on whether my guests finish it." But she had heard it, the thing under the question. I had built a whole life out of those letters, and it sat in her chest like a coal, because she had built one too, out of the same paper, and they had each built it alone, believing it shared, and it was shared. It had only been signed with the wrong name. "What was she like?" Beatrice asked, very carefully. "The woman you built." He leaned back. Outside, the rain had thinned to a grey drizzle, and the garden dripped. He looked at the window, not at her, and she had the sense of a man unlocking a drawer he kept locked even from himself. "Quick," he said. "Quicker than me," which I did not think I should ever say of anyone, and certainly never enjoy saying. She was kind, without being soft about it. She would tell me when I was wrong, and she was generally right, and she never once flattered me, which, when you are a duke, is rarer than you would believe. She thought mercy was the harder discipline, and justice the lazy one, and she nearly convinced me, and I have been arguing with her in my head about it for half a year. She loved the hares. She noticed small things. She wrote once that she had stood in the rain to watch a thrush break a snail on a stone, because she wanted to see whether it would manage it, and that it did, and that she had cried, and been ashamed of crying, and decided she was not ashamed after all. I read that letter until the folds wore through. He turned his head and looked at her. "Does your sister cry over thrushes, Miss Ashford?" Beatrice had cried over the thrush. It had been her thrush, her stone, her rain, her shame. Her decision not to be ashamed. She had written it at midnight, weeping, in the certainty that no one would ever know it was her. "No," she said, and the word cost her more than any she had ever spoken. "No, my sister does not." "I thought not," said the Duke of Ravensmere, and went back to his chocolate, and let the matter rest. But he had laid it on the table between them like a glove, and they both knew it, and the rest of the long, wet day, they circled it. They circled it in the library, where she could not keep away from the south windows, and he caught her with her hand on the very shelf he had described to her in February, and asked how she had known to go straight to the Cooper, and she said she had guessed, and he said she guessed like a woman who had been told. They circled it in the walled garden after the rain stopped, where the espaliered pears were exactly as he had written them, and she said so before she could stop herself. "They are trained beautifully." And he said quietly that he had not known the pears were famous as far as her county. They circled it over chess in the evening, where she opened with the defense he had described losing to once, in a letter, and beat him with it, and he sat back and looked at her across the board for a long, long moment, and said nothing at all, which frightened her more than any accusation. And underneath the circling, against every resolution she had carried 60 miles in a carriage, Beatrice Ashford fell the rest of the way in love with the Duke of Ravensmere. Not the man of the letters now, but the man across the chessboard, who laughed when he was beaten, who carried his grief like a man carrying water in cupped hands, careful not to spill it on anyone else, who had built a whole life out of her words, without knowing they were hers, and had not yet stopped grieving the woman he thought he had lost, who was sitting in front of him, refusing to be found. It was the third night, after the chess, that he told her about his brother. The candles had burned low, and Miss Freen had withdrawn with the last disapproving glance, and the rain had come back softly against the long windows, and Beatrice had been about to make her excuses and go up, when the Duke, who had been turning a captured chess piece between his fingers, a white knight, over and over, said, without looking up, "I had a brother. Did your sister's letters ever say so? I do not recall whether I wrote it." "You did not," said Beatrice, who knew the contents of every letter he had ever sent better than she knew her own catechism, and who had wondered about the house's emptiness, the unused nursery, the wing the servants had learned to leave alone. "You wrote once that the South Library was the only room at Ravensmere you could bear to sit in alone. I have wondered why ever since." "Henry," the Duke said. The knight turned in his fingers. 2 years older. He was to have all this, the title, the house, the trouble of it. And he was the sort of man who would have been good at the trouble, which I have never been. He liked people. He remembered their children's names. The tenants would have walked into the sea for him. He took a fever the winter I was 24, the ordinary kind, the kind that passes. And it did not pass. And I came back from Cambridge a younger son, and reached home a duke. And I have spent 4 years sitting in the one room in this house that does not have his step in the corridor outside it, learning to be a man the place was never built to get. He set the knight down at last, very precisely, in the centre of the board. "I am telling you this, Miss Ashford, because you asked why I sit alone in the South Library, and because in 11 months of letters, I never once told the person I most wished to tell. And tonight, for a reason I do not propose to examine too closely, I find that I can." Beatrice sat very still in the low gold light. She thought of all the letters in which she had argued and teased and shown off her cleverness, and of how she had never once been told this. The shape of the grief the whole house was built around. And she understood that he was handing her something he had handed no one, and that he was handing it, without knowing it, to the very woman who had spent 11 months earning the right to be handed it. "You are good at the trouble," she said. "You only do it differently than your brother would have. He would have walked into the sea for his tenants. You sat up 3 nights in a flooded cottage with a carter's family, the winter the river came over its banks. You wrote it to me once as though it were nothing, a single line, buried between 2 arguments about poetry. And you have never mentioned it since, which is the truest proof of the thing. It is the same courage, Your Grace. It only looks quieter in you. That is not a smaller thing. It is only a thing the world is worse at seeing." The Duke of Ravensmere looked at her across the chessboard, and for a long moment he did not say anything at all, and the rain came down, and the candle leaned in the draught, and Beatrice was suddenly and acutely aware that they were 2 people alone in a sleeping house at midnight, that the distance across the small table was nothing, that she had only to lean, and that she must not. That she of all the women in England must not, because every honest thing between them was built on a name that was not hers. "You say things," he said at last, very low, the way she said them. "The woman in the letters. You say the thing I did not know I needed said, until it is said, and then I cannot imagine having lived the years before it without it." He stopped himself. His jaw worked. "Forgive me, I am newly refused, and the hour is late, and I am saying things to my guest that I have no right to say to her, and you have been nothing but kind, and I will not make your kindness into a difficulty for you. Go up to bed, Miss Ashford, please, before I am a worse gentleman than your sister's refusal deserves." He managed, with visible effort, the ghost of a smile. "Take the White Knight with you, if you like. You won him fairly across this board not an hour ago. I find I have grown tired of losing to him." Beatrice rose. Her hand was not quite steady when she lifted the little carved knight from its square, and the brush of her fingers near his was an accident that neither of them named, and both of them felt to the wrist. and she said good night in a voice that came out softer than she had meant it to, and went up the cool, dark staircase to a room in his house, with his brother's grief in her hands, and his 11 months of letters in her bones. And she did not sleep, and was not, when she made herself examine it honestly in the grey hour before dawn, in the least sorry that she did not. "You will be glad to hear," Mrs. Freen announced at breakfast on the 4th morning, with the air of a woman delivering a verdict, "that the Marlow ford has dropped. Hodges says the road will carry a carriage by noon." "Does he?" said the Duke. "He does, Your Grace." "Thank you, Mrs. Freen." The housekeeper withdrew. The bee, or another bee, knocked at the high glass. Beatrice looked at her plate, and felt the 4 days fold shut like a book, and told herself it was for the best, and did not believe herself. And across the table, the Duke of Ravensmere set down his cup with great precision and said, in a voice she had heard before only on paper, "Stay another day." "Your Grace, 1 more day. I will give you a reason that will satisfy Mrs. Freen and your family both, and it will even be true." He looked at her steadily. "My mother arrives this afternoon, the Dowager. She has heard that an Ashford is under my roof, and she is coming 60 miles at speed to discover which one and to be appalled about it. And if you flee before she arrives, she will spend the rest of the summer convinced you fled from her, and she will make my life unlivable. Stay 1 day. Let her be appalled to your face. You are better at being appalled at than anyone I have ever met, and I should like, just once, to watch you do it." A ghost of the letters moved in his eyes. "And I am not ready for the road to dry. I have not said the thing I asked you to stay to hear, because I have not yet found the courage. And I am a coward who would like 1 more day to find it. And Beatrice, God help her, God help them both, said yes." The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere arrived at 4 with the force of a change in the weather. Beatrice heard her before she saw her. The wheels, the dogs set off barking, a voice in the marble hall pitched to carry to the servants' attics. And by the time she came down the great staircase, the old woman was already established in the drawing room, like a general establishing a position, gloved, ramrod, handsome in the way of a woman who had been a celebrated beauty 40 years before, and had decided never to surrender the ground. "So," said the Dowager, when Beatrice was presented. Her eyes went over the younger woman, the way a jeweller's eye goes over a stone offered too cheaply. "You are the other one." "I am Beatrice Ashford, ma'am." "You are the other one. The first one would not have my son, and now the family has sent the spare to see what may be salvaged. I have seen this maneuver executed by better houses than yours, Miss Ashford, and it has never once succeeded, and I will not have it succeed under this roof." She turned to her son. "Julian, have her carriage brought round. We will not be unkind about it, but we will be clear." "Beatrice came to deliver Cordelia's refusal, mother," the Duke said, with a patience that told Beatrice he had been managing this woman his whole life. "The roads detained her. She has been my guest, not my suitor, and she has behaved throughout with more honor than the situation deserved. She stays as my guest tonight and leaves tomorrow, and you will be civil to her, because she is the only person in 2 counties who has told me the truth this month, and I find I am not eager to lose the habit of it." The Dowager's gaze sharpened. She looked from her son to the girl and back, and something in the room shifted, and Beatrice understood that the old woman had heard, in that little speech, exactly what her son had not yet said aloud to anyone, and that the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere was very, very far from a fool. "The truth," the Dowager repeated softly. "How interesting. And here I had been told the elder Miss Ashford was the clever one." She smiled without warmth. "We shall see, over dinner, which sister is which." Dinner was a battlefield, and Beatrice fought it the only way she knew, which was not to lose her temper and not to lie. The Dowager set traps about the Ashford fortune, which was thin and getting thinner, about Cordelia's mysterious, engaged affections, which the Dowager clearly suspected of being a scandal in waiting, about whether Beatrice intended to console the Duke for his disappointment, and Beatrice parried each one, plainly, without heat, with a dry precision that more than once made the Duke look down at his plate to hide his face, until at last the Dowager set down her fork and said, "You are not at all what I expected, Miss Ashford. The other one was all surface, a lovely vase. You are something with an edge to it. I cannot decide yet whether the edge is a weapon, or merely a thing one cuts oneself on by accident." She lifted her glass. "I shall reserve judgment. Do not mistake that for approval. I have buried 2 duchesses' reputations in my time, and I would bury yours before breakfast if I thought you meant to climb into this family through my son's grief." "I mean to climb into nothing, Ma'am," Beatrice said. "I came to deliver a letter. I leave tomorrow. Your son's grief is his own, and I would not presume to be the cure for it. I have too much respect for the wound." The Dowager looked at her for a long time. She said, which from her was nearly a coronation, and the dinner survived to its end. It was the next morning, the morning Beatrice was finally, truly to leave, that the thing happened which changed the shape of everything. A child went into the lake. Not a child of the house. The Duke kept no nursery. It was the undergardener's boy, a small, fierce creature of 6 named Tom, who had been told 100 times to keep off the ornamental water, and had, that bright, drained morning, gone out onto the half-rotted landing stage after a duckling, and put his foot through a board. Beatrice was in the walled garden, saying a private goodbye to the famous pairs, when she heard the splash, and the single high cry, and then nothing, which was worse than the cry. And she was through the garden door, and across the lawn with her skirts in both fists before she had decided to move. The water was green and deep, and the boy was not coming up. Beatrice did not think about the cold, or the weeds, or the ruin of her one good travelling dress, or the fact that she swam, when she swam at all, badly, and only in the safe shallows of the Ashford mill pond. She thought about the dark closing over a small head. She went off the broken landing stage in a flat, ugly dive, came up gasping, found the place by the rising bubbles, and went down into the green and the cold with both hands open. She got a fistful of his shirt on the 2nd try. She got his face above the water on the 3rd. And then the weeds had her skirts, and the bank was further than it had been, and the boy was a dead weight of terror clamped around her throat. And for one long, grey instant, Beatrice Ashford understood, with strange calm, that she had, perhaps, misjudged the distance. Then there was a great surge beside her. The Duke of Ravensmere, coatless, half his shirt torn off on the broken boards, coming through the water like something the lake had risen up and made, and his arm was around them both, and he was hauling them to the bank with a strength that did not seem to cost him anything. And Mrs. Freen was there with blankets, and Tom was coughing up half the lake and bawling, which was the most beautiful sound Beatrice had ever heard. And she was on the grass on her hands and knees, being thoroughly, gracelessly sick, and the Duke's hand was flat and warm between her shoulder blades, and his voice, when it came, was not steady at all. "You went in," he said. "You cannot swim. Mrs. Freen told me at dinner you said you swam like a brick. And you went in." "He is 6, Beatrice managed. "You went in." He turned her gently by the shoulder so he could see her face, and his own was white and wet and undone. Every line of the disciplined host washed clean off it, and what was underneath was something she had no defense against at all. "If the lake had kept you, I should have gone in after you, and it would have kept us both, and I find, Miss Ashford, I find that I would rather it had kept us both than have it keep you. I find I have just discovered something about myself that I am going to have a great deal of trouble being sensible about." Behind them, on the gravel walk, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere stood with one hand pressed to her mouth, having seen the whole of it, the dive, the weeds, the rescue, and her son's face. And for once in her formidable life, she said nothing whatsoever. They did not leave that day either. There was a fever to fight off first, Tom's, which broke kindly by the second night, and a milder one of Beatrice's own from the cold green water, which Mrs. Freen nursed with broth and grim devotion. And by the time Beatrice was well enough to travel, something had changed in the house that no one would name and everyone could feel, the way you feel the turn of the year before you can point to a fallen leaf. The Duke came to read to her while she was ill. He brought the Cooper. He read her the passage about the hares, the tame hares the poet kept and grieved, and he did not look at the page while he read it, because he had it by heart. And when he reached the end, he closed the book and looked at her on the pillows and said, very simply, "It was you." She might have gone on lying. She was too tired and too happy and too newly returned from the green dark to manage it. "It was me," she said. "All of it. Cordelia could not be troubled to write to you, and I could not be troubled to stop. I told myself I was helping my sister make a great marriage. I was not. I was writing to you because it was the only hour of my day I was entirely myself, and I knew it could never come to anything. And I did it anyway, every week, for 11 months. And then she refused you, and they sent me to end it. And I came knowing exactly what I was ending. I have done you a great wrong, Your Grace, and the only thing I can say for myself is that not one single word of those letters was a lie. The name was a lie. Nothing else." The Duke of Ravensmere was quiet for a long moment. Then he took her ink-stained hand in both of his, careful, as though it might break, or as though he might, and pressed his mouth to the stained fingers, and she felt him not quite steady, and he said against her knuckles, "Then I have not lost her after all. I have only been an idiot about her surname." He lifted his head. "Beatrice, when you are well, when you can stand up and argue with me properly, on your feet, where I can watch you do it, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know now, so that you have time to prepare your defense, that I intend to be very difficult to refuse." And for one whole golden week of high summer, before the world remembered them, Beatrice Ashford was happier than she had known a person could be. She walked the walled garden with him in the long evenings while the pears swelled on the warm brick. They argued mercy and justice across the chessboard, and neither of them won, which was the whole pleasure of it. He showed her the morning room, where the gold light came in before 9, and did not say a word about who he had once imagined sitting in it, because he no longer had to imagine her. She was there, with a book she would not put down for him, and he stood in the doorway and watched her not put it down, and looked like a man who has been let in out of weather he had stopped believing would ever end. They spoke once, lightly, in the future tense. "When the pears come in," he said, "you must see them picked. It is the best week of the year here." And neither of them flinched, and the not flinching was its own quiet vow. It could not last. She knew it could not last. There was a refused sister at home, and a dowager reserving judgment, and a fortune that did not match, and a whole society that lived to make a meal of exactly this. And somewhere, out on the London roads, a piece of news was already travelling towards them that would set the house alight. But for that one week, the trap that had closed around them in the library had become, against all sense, the only place in the world either of them wished to be. The news came up the London road on the 8th morning, in the form of a society paper, 3 days old, and a letter from Beatrice's mother, written in a hand that shook. Cordelia had eloped. The otherwise engaged affections had a name at last, and it was Captain Marcus Vane, who had no fortune, and a great many debts, and a commission he had sold to pay for a chaise to the border, and the two of them were over the anvil at Gretna before anyone at home had finished discovering they were gone. The paragraph in the paper was vicious, in the genteel way such paragraphs are. It named the Ashfords. It recalled, archly, that the elder Miss Aid had but lately disappointed a certain noble suitor in the north, and it wondered aloud, in print, what manner of family produced one daughter who refused a duke, and another who could not be made to stay refused. And then, because malice is industrious, and because a great house leaks, And because the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere was not the only person who had begun to wonder how the celebrated and rather stupid elder Miss Ashford had ever written letters clever enough to make a thoughtful duke propose, the second story broke beneath the first, 3 days later, and it was the one that did the true damage. The Ashford courtship had been a forgery. The younger sister, the plain spinster nobody, had written every line of it in her sister's name, had counterfeited a love, counterfeited a hand, and then, when the elder threw the prize away, had carried herself 60 miles in a borrowed dress to take up the courtship she had been conducting all along and finish, in her own person, the entrapment she had begun on paper. That was the shape of it in the world's mouth. Every true fact bent 1 degree towards villainy. The hairs, the thrush, the stained fingers, the long midnight hours when she had been most herself. All of it recut as the patient craft of a schemer who had set out to steal a dukedom 1 envelope at a time. And there was no part of it Beatrice could deny, because every fact in it was, in its bare bones, true. The Dowager moved the way a great house moves to save itself, fast and without sentiment. By the time Beatrice came down, sick again, this time with nothing the broth could touch, the drawing room held the Dowager, a London lawyer who had ridden through the night, and a name Beatrice had not heard before and would not forget. Lady Honoria Carmichael, a marquis's daughter, 24, unimpeachable, dull, and available, whose family would be glad of a duke, and whose reputation was a wall thick enough to stop any scandal the Ashfords could throw. "It is the only answer," the Dowager was saying, as Beatrice reached the door, and she did not lower her voice when she saw the girl there. She meant her to hear it. "A counter-announcement, at once, in the same papers. The Duke of Ravensmere, far from being any woman's dupe, is to marry Lady Honoria Carmichael, a match long understood between the families. Let them print that under their filth, and watch it die. It saves the dukedom, Julian. It saves your name. It is the only thing that does, and you know it, and you will do it, because you were raised to put this house before your own heart, and I have never once known you to fail at it." And Beatrice looked at the Duke of Ravensmere, at the man who had read her the hairs by heart, who had gone into the green water after her, who had stood in the morning-room doorway and watched her not put down a book. And she saw him standing very still by the south windows, with his jaw set hard and his eyes down, the disciplined host put back on like a coat, and she heard him say nothing. He said nothing. He did not turn. He did not contradict his mother. He did not cross the room. He stood in the bars of gold light that came in before 9, in the very room where he had let her be the woman he had imagined, and he let the lawyer's papers, and his mother's voice, and Lady Honoria's unimpeachable name fill the silence where 1 word from him would have been enough. And the word did not come. Beatrice did not wait to be sent away. She understood, standing in the doorway with her mother's shaking letter still crushed in her hand, what she was watching. He had weighed it. He had set the 11 months of letters on one side, and the dukedom, the name, the unstained future, his mother's whole iron creed on the other. And the scale had come down where it had always been going to come down, and he had chosen the name after all. He had let them call her a forger, and had not once said she was not. He had taken the truest thing she had ever made, and, when the world turned to look at it, he had been ashamed of it, and of her. The week in the garden had been a refused man's holiday from his grief, and the holiday was over, and she had been a fool, a clever fool who had read his mind for 11 months and somehow failed to read the one plain fact that a duke does not marry the spinster who tricked him, whatever he murmurs against her knuckles in a sick room when no one is watching. She went up the cool, shadowed staircase she had once described to a sister who never listened, and she packed her one ruined dress and the few things that were hers. And she did not weep, because she had decided, long ago, standing in the rain over a broken snail, what was and was not worth being ashamed of. and she would not be ashamed of having loved him. She would only be ashamed of having believed, for one golden week, that being loved back was a thing the world would permit her. The carriage was brought round. It was the Duke's own carriage. That was a courtesy, and the courtesy was somehow the cruelest stroke of all. Mrs. Freen came out onto the steps with a hamper and a face like a closed door, and pressed Beatrice's cold hands once, hard, and said, "Now you listen to me, miss," and then stopped, because she was a servant, and there were things a servant could not say, and turned and went in. The dowager came to the top of the steps. She looked down at Beatrice for a long moment, and there was no triumph in her face. That was the strangest thing. Beatrice had expected triumph, and found instead something almost like grief, held under glass. "You are not what I thought you were, Miss Ashford," the old woman said quietly. "I will say that much, since no one else in this house has the courage to say anything at all this morning. But what you are has no place here, because of what the world has decided you are, and in my experience the world's decision is the only one that signifies. Go home. Be the woman who is too good for all of us, somewhere we do not have to watch it. It is the kindest thing left to do for any of us." The Duke did not come out at all. Beatrice got into the carriage. The door was shut. The wheels turned, through summer dust now dry again, out between the two iron wings crowned with their stone raven, and she watched the great house she had furnished in her imagination for 11 months grow small in the window, and then vanish behind the lime avenue. And she set her stained hands in her lap, and she went home, 60 miles, to a family in ruins, having delivered, in the end, 2 refusals. Her sister's to the Duke, and now her own, to the only hour of her day she had ever been entirely herself. Home was worse than she had let herself imagine. Ashford Place had never been grand, but it had been respectable, and respectability was the only coin the family had ever truly possessed. And now it was spent. Cordelia's elopement had emptied the house of every visitor and half its credit in a fortnight. Sir Henry sat in his study with the door shut and the decanter out. Lady Ashford took to her room, with a vinaigrette and a grievance, and Cordelia herself, married now and frightened, and already learning what a chaise to the border buys and what it does not, wrote tear-blotted letters from a set of cheap lodgings in Bath, begging for money no one had, and signed them, for the first time in her life, in her own unaided hand, which was, Beatrice noticed with a tired flicker of something that was almost laughter, atrocious. Into this wreck Beatrice walked, and rolled up her sleeves, and did the thing she had always done, which was the work nobody thanked her for. She went through her father's accounts, and found the bleeding, and stopped what could be stopped. She wrote, in her own name now, gloriously, miserably her own, to the creditors, and the lawyers, and the one aunt with money and a soft heart, and she was so plain, and so exact, and so entirely without self-pity, that 3 of them did what she asked. She sat with her mother through the worst of the vinaigrette afternoons, and did not once say, "I told you, which of your daughters you ought to have looked at." And at night, when the house was finally quiet, she did not write to anyone at all, because there was no one to write to, and the silence of that was a thing she had to learn, the way a body learns to favor a wound. She did not let herself think about Ravensmere. She had a rule about it, the way she had a rule about the thrush. She would think about it for exactly as long as it took to bank the kitchen fire each night, and then she would close that door and go up to bed. And most nights she even managed it. She read the announcement when it came. She made herself read it, the way she made herself do all the hard, plain things. The Duke of Ravensmere to Lady Honoria Carmichael, a match long understood between the families. It was in 3 papers. It was exactly as the Dowager had promised it would be, and it killed the scandal exactly as the Dowager had promised it would. And the forged letters story curled up and withered beneath it within the week. Because the world cannot keep 2 appetites at once, and a duke's respectable engagement is more nourishing than a spinster's disgrace. Within a month, no one spoke of Beatrice Ashford at all. She had achieved, at last, the thing she had wanted all those 11 months. She was nobody again, unwatched, returned to the safe shallows. It was unbearable. There was, that August, one offer, for she was not, even disgraced, entirely without value. A baronet's daughter with a clear head is a useful thing in a county, whatever the papers print. Mr. Pelham, the new rector at Ashford-cum-Martin, a widower of 42, with 3 children, and a kind, tired, sensible face, came one warm evening to take tea with Sir Henry, and, when the cups were cleared, asked Beatrice to walk with him in the lane, and there, among the dusty hedgerows, offered her his hand. He did it decently. He said he had no illusions of romance to trouble her with, that he knew her situation and did not regard it, that she was clever and good with accounts, and his children needed a mother, and she needed a roof that did not leak credit, and that he thought 2 sensible people might make a quiet, useful, respectable life of it, and be glad enough. It was, Beatrice knew, the practical answer. It was the sentence the whole world would have written for her. The disgraced, clever sister, salvaged into usefulness by a good, plain man. The scandal closed like an account balanced at last. A year before, she might even have taken it and been grateful, and called the gratitude contentment, the way clever women learn to do. "You do me a great honor, Mr. Pelham," she said, "and I am going to refuse you, and I am going to tell you why. Because you have been honest with me, and you deserve the same coin. You are quite right that I am clever and good with accounts and in need of a roof. But I have learned a thing this summer that I did not know in the spring, and it has spoiled me for a quiet, useful life. And the thing is this. I know now what it is to be argued with by someone who is glad I argue back. I had it for 11 months on paper, and 4 days in person, and I lost it. And it has ruined me for less. I will not marry where there is nothing to lose by it. I would rather keep my own pen in my father's leaking house than balance someone else's accounts forever in a dry one. It is not pride, though it will look like pride, and it is certainly not your fault. It is only that I have been spoiled, Mr. Pelham, thoroughly and permanently spoiled, by knowing what the other thing feels like. And a woman who has stood in the rain to watch a thrush break a snail cannot afterwards pretend she did not see it manage." Mr. Pelham looked at her for a moment in the dusty August light, and then he smiled, a real smile, rueful and relieved at once, and said that he had rather thought she would say something of the kind, and that whoever had spoiled her was a fortunate man and a great fool to have let her come home, and that he hoped, for both their sakes, the fool came to his senses. Then he walked her back to the gate, and took his sensible, tired face away, and married, the following spring, a sensible, tired widow who suited him very well, and Beatrice was glad of it, and meant the gladness. But she stood at the gate after he had gone, in the last of the warm light, and thought, "There, I have refused a duke in my sister's name, and a rector in my own, and I am 26, and disgraced, and entirely myself. And it is the loneliest I have ever been, and I would not trade 1 hour of the 4 days for 50 quiet years of being grateful." And she went in, and banked the kitchen fire, and shut the door on the thought of Ravensmere. And most nights she even managed it. What Beatrice did not know, what she could not have known, 60 miles away with the kitchen fire banked and the door shut on the thought of him, was that the Duke of Ravensmere's silence in the morning room had not been consent. It had been the silence of a man doing arithmetic he hated. And the moment her carriage was through the gates, he had finished the sum, and he had not liked the answer his mother had written for him, and he had spent the week since taking it apart. "You let her go," the dowager had said to him that first night, finding him in the dark library with the locked drawer open and the bundle of letters out on the desk in front of him for the first time in months. It was the right thing. It was the only thing. You will see that in time. "I let her go," the Duke had agreed, in a voice she did not like, "because you set the whole machine running before I had my feet under me, and because I am, as you have spent 30 years informing me, a man who puts this house first. I let her go. I did not say I would marry where you have aimed me. Sit down, Mother. We are going to talk, you and I, about the difference between saving a name and being worthy of it. And it is going to take us most of the night. And at the end of it, I'm going to do something you will hate. And I would rather you heard my reasons first. He had the letters in his hands while he said it. He turned them as he spoke, the way he turned everything when he thought. You have read them, I think, he said. You went into this drawer the week the forgery story broke. Freen told me. You read them, looking for the proof of her scheming. He looked up. Did you find it? The Dowager was silent. No, he said. You did not, because it is not there. I have read these letters until the folds wore through, and I will tell you what is in them, since you have read them too, and we may speak plainly. There is a mind in them that is better than mine, and kinder than mine, and braver than mine. There is a woman in them who stood in the rain to watch a thrush break a snail because she could not bear not to know whether it would manage, and who wept over it, and decided not to be ashamed of weeping, and who therefore knows something about courage that I have spent 28 years and a great deal of consequence failing to learn. That woman wrote to me every week for 11 months, knowing it could come to nothing, asking for nothing, signing another woman's name, taking not one thing from me but the pleasure of my argument. And you have helped the world to call her a thief. He set the letters down. She went into the lake. Mother. You saw it. She cannot swim, and she went into the lake after a gardener's boy without 1 half-second's pause. And a person does not become that in a crisis who has been a calculating fraud in the quiet. You cannot counterfeit that. I have seen counterfeits all my life. Men have been counterfeiting things at me since I was breeched, because I am a dukedom with a man somewhere inside it. She is the realest thing that has ever walked into this house, and I let your machine carry her out of it. And I have been sitting here every night since, asking myself which of us is the true forger. The woman who signed the wrong name to 11 months of truth, or the man who signed his own name to a lie this family calls an engagement. Lady Honoria, the Dowager began. Lady Honoria does not want me, the Duke said. She wants to be a duchess, which is a different appetite and a perfectly respectable one, and I will not punish her for it. And I will not marry her for it either. I have written to her father. I have been honest with him, more honest than this family has been in a generation. And I have offered him every reparation a broken understanding can decently carry. And he is a sensible man, and he has taken it, because his daughter no more loves me than I love her, and a marquis can count. The engagement you announced will be unannounced, quietly, if the world permits, loudly, if it does not. I am prepared for loudly. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere had gone very white. You will resurrect the scandal. Both scandals. You will hand the world back its meal and put yourself on the plate beside her. Yes, said her son. I have thought about that a great deal. And I find I do not care. And I've been trying to understand why a man raised as carefully as you raised me to care about exactly this does not care. And I have arrived at an answer you are not going to like. He stood. He was very tall in the dark library, and for the first time in her life, the Dowager saw, fully, that her son was not a boy she managed, but a man she had run out of arguments for. I do not care what the world calls me beside her, because I would rather be disgraced beside the woman who went into the lake than respectable beside a wall. You taught me to put this house first. I am putting it first. A house is not its name, Mother. Names are only the part the world can see. A house is whether there is anyone in it worth coming home to. You have spent 30 years polishing the part the world can see, and I have spent 28 learning the trick from you. And we have between us very nearly furnished this place with a duchess made of plaster. I would rather have the woman with ink on her hands. I am going to go and get her, the moment I can do it without making her the subject of a fresh paragraph. And I am going to ask her, in a manner that gives her every possible ground to refuse me, because she has earned the right to refuse me far better than her sister ever did. And if she does refuse me, I shall have deserved it, and I shall bear it, and I shall not marry a wall to console myself. Now, will you help me do this properly? Or will you make me do it over your objection? Because I will do it either way, and I would so much rather, just once, do a brave thing with my mother beside me than across the room from her. And the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere, who had buried 2 duchesses' reputations, and had never in her formidable life been spoken to in that voice by her own child, sat in the dark a long time, with the bundle of letters between them on the desk. And at last, she reached out one ringed hand and rested it on top of them, lightly, the way one rests a hand on something one has decided to stop guarding, and said, in a voice with the iron gone soft at last, "Read me the one about the thrush. I read it once, looking for a swindle. I should like to hear it read by the only person in England who understands what is in it." She lifted her chin, and something that had been a wall for 40 years cracked very quietly down its middle. "And then, Julian, then you will tell me how a dowager goes about unmaking an engagement she has made. Because if we are to do a foolish, magnificent, ruinous thing in this family, we will at least do it competently. And you have never in your life unmade a scandal without me." The carriage that came up the Ashford Drive in the last week of August was not a discreet one. Beatrice was in the kitchen garden when she heard it, on her knees among the late peas, with her sleeves pushed up and a streak of earth across one cheek, doing the work that steadied her. And she heard the wheels on the gravel and the particular note of a heavy, well-sprung coach, and she sat back on her heels with her heart going wrong in her chest before her mind had even named the sound. She knew that coach. She had ridden 60 miles home in it. And she had time to think, with a flash of something that was half hope and half pure terror, that he had at least had the decency not to send it empty this time, before the gate at the end of the garden opened, and the Duke of Ravensmere came through it. He looked terrible, which she found she could not be sorry for. He had ridden ahead of the coach the last stage, and was dusty to the knee, and there were shadows under his grey eyes that had not been there in the garden at Ravensmere. And he stopped just inside the gate when he saw her, kneeling in the dirt, in her oldest dress, with earth on her face and a basket of peas at her side. And he looked at her as though she were the morning room with the gold light in it, and he did not say any of the things she had braced for. "You have earth on your face," he said unsteadily. "Just here." He touched his own cheek. "I have come a very long way to tell you that, and a number of other things, and I find that is the only one I can manage at the moment. So it will have to stand as the beginning of the speech I have been writing for 3 weeks, and cannot, now that I am looking at you, remember one word of." Beatrice did not get up. She stayed where she was among the peas, because her legs would not have held her, and because some hard, clear part of her, the part that had banked the kitchen fire every night and shut the door on him, would not let her run to a man who had stood silent in a window while the world was taught to call her a thief. "You are engaged, Your Grace," she said. "It was in 3 papers. I read it. You should not be here." "There is nothing left here to entrap you with. Even my dress is borrowed back from the rag bag, as you see." He flinched at entrap, full in the face, and took it, and did not look away. "I deserved that," he said. "I am going to let you say a great many things like it, and I am going to deserve all of them. And I am not going to defend myself because there is no defense, only an explanation, which is a poorer thing, and which I will give you if you will let me, and which you may then throw back at me, and you will still be right." He came 2 steps further into the garden and stopped, keeping his distance, as a man keeps his distance from something he is afraid of startling. I stood in that window and said nothing, while my mother and a lawyer and a marquis's empty daughter decided your character for you. And I have asked myself every night since, what kind of man does that? And the answer is a coward who has been trained since the cradle to mistake the saving of a name for the doing of a right, and who needed 3 weeks and a great deal of his mother's furniture thrown about to tell the two apart. I did not consent to that engagement, Beatrice. I have unmade it. But that is not an excuse, because you could not know I would unmake it. You only knew what you saw, which was a man who let you be carried out of his house in his own carriage, and did not come down the steps. I let you believe the worst of me, because I had, in that moment, earned the worst of me. I have come to earn something else. You let them call me a forger. Her voice cracked on it at last, the thing she had not let herself say even to the kitchen fire. You read those letters until the folds wore through. You told me so. And then you stood in a window and let the world decide they were a swindle, and you said nothing. And I went home and learned to be nobody again, because being nobody was at least quiet. Do you know what you took from me? Not the marriage. I never once let myself want the marriage. You took the letters. You made 11 months of the only hours I was ever entirely myself into a thing I have to be ashamed of. That is what your silence cost, Your Grace. Not your name. Mine, the only one I had that was real. The Duke of Ravensmere went down on one knee in the dirt of the Ashford kitchen garden, in front of God and the late peas and a streak of earth on her cheek, level with her at last, and his face was wet, and he did not trouble to hide it. Then let me give it back to you, he said, in front of as many people as it takes. He reached into his coat and brought out a packet, and she knew it. She knew the shape and the worn folds of it before he opened his hand, because she had made it, sheet by sheet, over 11 months. The bundle of her letters, tied in a ribbon, every one of them. These are yours, not Cordelia's. I have crossed the name off every envelope in my own hand. Look, you may see it. And I have written the right one beneath, because I am done lying about whose mind this is. And this, he drew out a folded paper, printed, fresh, is tomorrow's. My mother set it in the same 3 papers that carried the rest, and she wrote it herself. And she made me promise to tell you she wrote it herself, because she said you would know what it cost her, and that she wished you to know. Beatrice took the printed sheet in earth-stained fingers that would not hold quite steady, and read it. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere wishes it to be universally understood that the letters, lately and maliciously termed a forgery, were nothing of the kind. They were the freely given correspondence of Miss Beatrice Ashford, a gentlewoman of more wit and more courage than this writer has met in 40 years of society, conducted in her sister's name from a delicacy that does her honor, and a modesty that does her too much of it. Any person repeating the contrary slander will answer to this house. The Duke of Ravensmere is not, and never was, engaged to Lady Honoria Carmichael. He is, if she will have him, and this writer is by no means certain she should, entirely at the disposal of Miss Beatrice Ashford, who saved a child from drowning under his roof and is, in the considered opinion of his mother, a great deal too good for him. At the foot of the garden the gate opened a second time, and the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere came through it, upright, gloved, 60 miles of dust on her travelling cloak, leaning rather more than she would have liked on a stick, and she came down the path between the peas and stopped beside her kneeling son, and looked down at the girl in the dirt with the printed slander undone in her hands. And she did not unbend her back, but she unbent something behind it. I have put my name to a great many burials, Miss Ashford, the old woman said. That is the first thing I have ever printed that I am not ashamed of, and I find it sits oddly and rather well. I told you the world's decision was the only one that signified. I was wrong. Which is a sentence I have used perhaps 4 times in my life, and never with witnesses. So, attend. I was wrong. The world decides what it is told to decide, and I have spent 40 years among the people who tell it, and we are not, on the whole, worth obeying. I have come 60 miles to tell the papers they were liars, and my son, he was a fool. and you that you will write. And to find out, because I confess I cannot tell from here, and it is killing me, whether you are going to have him." She planted the stick. "Well, you refused him once, on paper, in your sister's name. Are you going to refuse him in person, in your own? Because I warn you, Miss Ashford, this family has had quite enough of being refused by Ashfords, and if you mean to do it, I should like to sit down first." And Beatrice Ashford began, helplessly, through tears, to laugh. And the laughing undid the last hard-banked thing in her, and she set the basket of peas carefully aside, because she was a practical woman, even at the great moments, and she took the Duke of Ravensmere's dusty face in both her earth-stained hands, the hands he had once pressed his mouth to, and she said, "I am not going to refuse you. I am going to make terms, because I always make terms, and you knew that about me before you knew my face. And if you wanted a woman who would simply say yes, you should have married the wall." She drew a shaking breath. "I will have you, but I keep my own pen. I will write what I please, and sign my own name to it, and you will never again let anyone, your mother or the papers or the king himself, tell the world a thing about me that you know to be untrue, without standing up in the window and saying so. I will argue with you over breakfast, and beat you at chess, and weep over thrushes, and you will not once, be ashamed of any of it. And the next time the world turns to look at us, Julian, and it will, it always will, you will not do arithmetic. You will come down the steps." She pressed her forehead to his. "Those are my terms. They are not negotiable. I have, as you know, a great many opinions, and I will not be talked out of any of them to spare your feelings." "Accepted," said the Duke of Ravensmere against her mouth. "All of them, without amendment, in front of the witness of my choosing." And he kissed her there in the kitchen garden, with the dust and the peas, and his mother looking on. And the Dowager Duchess turned away to give them what privacy a garden allows, and was discovered, a moment later, to be weeping into her glove, and denied it to the end of her days. They were married in September, quietly, at the small church on the Ravensmere land, with the harvest still gold in the home fields, and the air gone soft at last after the long dry summer. It was not the wedding the Dowager would have designed a year before. There was no London crush, no bishop, no half the peerage craning to see. And that, she announced to anyone who would listen, was precisely why it was the best wedding she had attended in 30 years. The world had done what the world does. Having been told, in 3 papers and the Dowager's own unmistakable voice, that Miss Beatrice Ashford was a wit and a heroine, and far too good for the Duke who had been lucky enough to secure her, it had promptly decided it had always thought so, and the very columns that had called her a forger in midsummer were calling her the season's most romantic match by the time the harvest was in, and Beatrice read them aloud at breakfast in a voice of grave wonder, and made her husband laugh until he had to put down his cup. She had made her terms, and she kept them, all of them, and so did he. When the Dowager Lady Carslake, who had started the forgery story over a card table, presumed to be cool to the new Duchess at the first county assembly, the Duke of Ravensmere crossed the entire room in front of everyone and asked his wife to dance, with such pointed devotion that the temperature of the whole neighborhood corrected itself by morning. He came down the steps. He had promised he would, and he did, every time. And after a while, he did not have to be brave about it, because it had simply become the kind of man he was. Cordelia he forgave, in the end, because Beatrice asked it, and because forgiveness, Beatrice told him, was the harder discipline, and the lazy man chose the grudge. And she said it across a chessboard, and he recognized the argument, because it was the one she had nearly won on paper a year and a half before. And this time he let her win it outright. A small settlement went quietly to Bath, enough to lift Captain and Mrs. Vane out of the worst of the lodgings, on the single condition, set by the new Duchess in her own hand, that Cordelia learn to manage a household account, which Cordelia did, badly at first and then less badly. And the two sisters wrote to each other after that, both of them, now, in their own atrocious and elegant hands, signing their own names, which Beatrice privately considered the truest happy ending the whole affair produced. And the letters, the 11 months of them, with the wrong name crossed off every envelope, and the right one written beneath in the Duke's careful hand. Beatrice did not burn, though she thought about it once. She kept them in the locked drawer in the South Library where he had kept them, and now and again on a winter evening, one or the other of them would take a single sheet out and read it aloud. The hares, the thrush, the long argument about mercy. And they would fall to arguing it again from the beginning, as though no time had passed at all, because the truth was that none of it had ever been a lie. And a thing that was true does not stop being true for having been wrongly signed. The 1st October of their marriage, the pears came in. He had told her about it once, in the walled garden, in the future tense that had frightened them both with its boldness. When the pears come in, you must see them picked. It is the best week of the year here. And on the first cool, bright morning of that week, he found her already gone from their bed, and went looking, and found her where he might have known to look, in the walled garden, in the early gold light, among the espaliered trees trained against the warm brick, exactly as he had described them to her in a letter in February, when she was 60 miles away and signing another woman's name. She had a basket on her arm, and earth on her hands, and a smudge of it on her cheek, and she was reaching up into the laden branches with the particular fierce concentration she gave to anything worth doing, and she did not hear him come. He stood in the garden door and watched his wife pick pears in the morning light, and did not say a word, because he had spent a year learning that the best of the moments were the ones you did not interrupt, and because there had been a time, not so long before, when he had stood in another doorway watching her not put down a book, and had thought it was the most that life would ever let him have, and had been wrong, gloriously wrong, by the whole width of a life. She caught him there at last and turned, and the light was on her face, and her hands were full of fruit and earth. "You have pears to pick, Your Grace," she said, "and you are standing in a doorway being sentimental, which I will not have, not at this hour and not in my garden. Come and make yourself useful, and I will tell you about a thrush I watched this morning on the lawn. There was a snail and a stone, and I stood in the wet grass like a madwoman to see whether it would manage." "And did it?" he asked, crossing the warm grass to her. "It did," said the Duchess of Ravensmere, and reached up to set a ripe pear in his hand, her stained fingers closing over his. "It always does, in the end, if you have the patience to stand in the rain and watch."